Hopefully, I think we're on air. Hi, everyone. This afternoon, or whatever time you're tuning into this, I am joined by the fabulous Nir Eyal, all the way from Palo Alto. Hi, Nir. How are you doing today?
Hi, so good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. Now, I've been very much a fan of Nir's work for quite a while, and he's written a book which I have nearly in triplicate. First, the fabulous version, book-bound version from the publishers, and then also another one. And Nir, can you hold up your beautiful yellow
Yes.
hardback book?
This is the latest and greatest version, which will be available on Tuesday in the United States and on Thursday in the UK.
Yay! Awesome. So I wanted to jump at the chance to get Nir to tell us a little bit about this book before it becomes this inimitable bestseller, which is going to because it's fascinating and useful. So Nir, what's the lowdown? What is your book Hooked all about?
Right. So there's two main reasons I wrote Hooked. Number one was to help product makers build better. I'm a two-time entrepreneur, and one of the things that was most frustrating about running my last company was that we were constantly struggling with trying to figure out what should we build, right? Where do we devote our limited resources? What's the next feature, the next product, the next improvement that we build, and what do we not build? And so Hooked is really about giving product makers a framework that they can use if their product requires repeat engagement. Hooked gives them a framework to assess if their business has habit-forming potential, and if it doesn't, if it's missing something, what to do about it. So it's really a how-to guide. It's a very practical book to help people build habit-forming products, products that bring people back on their own. The second reason I wrote Hooked was because I think the world is becoming a potentially more addictive place, and I think that all of us can benefit by being smarter consumers, by understanding how products change our behavior so that we can put technology in its place.
Cool. And actually, I want to just I'm just going to hold up a page of your book. I'm going to hold it up slowly so in case there's poor connection, people can actually see it. And this is actually the hooked model. So you have trigger and action, investment, and then variable reward. So it's really a very concrete, cohesive process that you can take, whether you're designing things or you want to figure out how you're getting addicted to various products that you're using, to really break down the psychology and the fundamentals behind it. So can you tell us a little bit about what are examples of platforms or products that do this four-step model really well?
Sure. So if you think about the kind of products that you find yourself using with little or no conscious thought, checking Facebook or using, pulling out your smartphone throughout the day, or Twitter or Snapchat or Instagram, on the enterprise side, products like Salesforce or GitHub or Stack Overflow, these products that we find ourselves gravitating to with little or no conscious thought. And of course, even offline, there's all sorts of products that grab our attention, that compel us. Yesterday, I was in San Francisco when the San Francisco Giants won the World Series, and I was unlucky enough to be giving a talk, a presentation on the book during the World Series. And thankfully, I had a room full of people who didn't care that much about the World Series, but some of them did, and they had a real difficult time listening to me talk because, sports, spectator sports, has an amazing ability to keep us engaged, to keep us coming back. And in all sorts of products that we find most compelling, the ones that grab our attention and don't let go, you will find these. And so that's this four-step model that I describe in Hooked. It's a process that starts with a trigger, an action, a reward, and then an investment. And it's through successive cycles through these hooks that we begin to change our tastes, preferences are formed, and habits take hold.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the nature of addiction and how many people, in media and then sort of people like consumers, us, like, tend to think of certain platforms or softwares as more addictive. So, for instance, email, the notifications we get on Facebook or Twitter, and then we're kind of in this dopamine loop of just constant checking. What's the difference between useful habits and not useful habits, or sort of habits that abuse our natural tendency to want to get that variable reward? What's the difference between positive and negative habits? And then also, how do we break the negative ones?
Right. That's a great question. So I didn't title the book How to Build Addictive Products because addiction has a very specific definition. I think sometimes people mischaracterize my work as teaching people how to build addiction, but that's not what I'm trying to do, because addiction, the definition of an addiction is a compulsion or dependency on a behavior or substance that hurts the user. right?
Mm.
That's bad. That doesn't improve their life. That takes away from their life. And so that's not what we want to do. Obviously, we don't want to build products that hurt people. But habits, on the other hand, have very similar properties to addictions in that they're done with little or no conscious thought. They're compelling, and yet habits can be good or bad. And the difference is how they serve us, right? Do they improve our life or do they take away from our life? Now, addictions are always bad. And so this book is not about creating addictions, it's about creating healthy habits. But there are some people, of course, who do get addicted to some products. And I
Mm.
kind of have a formula and a framework to help people who are making habit-forming products that are potentially addictive figure out how they should allocate their human capital. Because the question today is not can we form habits, can we make products compelling to bring people back, but should we? And how do we responsibly apply this deeper psychology to the products we're building?
Okay, so let's talk ethics for a while then, because as you mentioned, there are some people who will always fall towards the outlying edges of use, whether that's becoming addicted to a Twitter feed, which potentially, so you could use that habit for good or for bad, or you could get sucked in. So you're always going to have people who are perhaps more vulnerable to falling into negative habit patterns. What responsibility do you think developers have in protecting those people? Can we protect those people? Or do you think it's a question of them making their own choices? So I'm interested in that area between
Right.
agency and non-agency, and how much of that is kind of taken away by creating stuff that's potentially more habit forming.
Right. So the good news is that the products that we're talking about, these are not things that are used intravenously. Right. We're not talking about
Thank
drugs. We're
God.
not injecting Facebook into our bloodstream.
Oh.
Not yet, at least. But of course, these things change our behaviors. They're even known to change our brain wiring. But
Mm.
everything changes our brain, right? That's nothing new. Any new learned behavior changes the structuring of the brain. That's not new. And frankly, distraction isn't new. The ancient Greeks had this concept of akrasia. It was this tendency to not do the things you know you're supposed to do. So distraction away from the things we're supposed to do is really nothing new. Now, what's different is that the access to these products has become ubiquitous, right? It's very easy to log into these products, to check email, to go onto Facebook or Twitter any time of day, wherever we are, because we're carrying around these little devices with us everywhere we go. But for most people, they're perhaps bad habits. And so the book gives a kind of by understanding how these things work, what's the deeper psychology, we can gain control over these bad habits and do something about it. Right? We can put technology in its place. There's lots of ways that I've applied the hook in my life by breaking the hook, by consciously being aware of, hey, here's the bad habits I don't want in my life, and how do I break those habits? Well, I take a look at the hook, and I find ways to strategically break the hook where it's not serving me. But I wouldn't be able to do that without understanding how these products work and how they hook us. And we can go into some specific examples if you like. But when it comes to addiction, it turns out that there's a very small percentage of people who actually form addictions with these products. And so it looks like when you look at different industries, from gambling to online multiplayer games, or even things like Facebook and Twitter, it seems to be around 2 to 5% of the population. So 95% of the population doesn't have a problem with these things. In fact, they help us, right? I don't want to go back to an age before Facebook or Twitter or constant access to email. We have to manage these things, but they've really improved our lives overall. I think very few people would want these technologies to no longer exist. But for those small percentage of people who actually do have an addiction, where these products actually hurt their lives, then I think that there's a responsibility that makers of these technologies have. And so I have put out the call, and I've written several articles on this topic of that I believe that companies making potentially addictive products should create what's called a use and abuse policy. That there should be some kind of number that if you use this product to that extent, if you're, for example, on Facebook for 20 hours a week, let's say, or 30 hours a week, there should be some kind of number where Facebook says, you know what, that's too much. Maybe you should take a break. And some companies are already doing this. Stack Overflow, for example, after 20 hours of use, you can't accrue any more points on that platform. Right? They have a breaker, so to speak, to get users to take a pause. The good news is that when you compare interactive products to addictive products of the past, right? Addictive products are nothing new, right? We've had addictions for a very long time. But if you were an alcohol maker, right, if you were a distiller, you could throw up your hands and say, well, we don't know who the alcoholics are. How could we know?
Hmm.
The opportunity here and the promise of this new age of interactive technologies is that for the first time, these companies know, right? Facebook knows how much we're using Facebook, and gaming companies know how much we're playing. So for the first time, these companies can do something about it. They know on a user level who's using and how much, and that means that they could potentially do something about overuse and abuse.
Hmm. Fascinating. I think that because that takes us into really interesting territory around free will, and then around well, yes, legislation. It's something that I've been thinking about quite a bit recently, certainly in terms of data mining and in terms of the kinds of freedom that we think that we have or that we can legislate against. So, for instance, I don't know if you followed the New Zealand elections recently, but there was a massive panel debate with, I've forgotten his name. So wait, there was Glenn Greenwald, Kim Dotcom, and Bob Amsterdam, and a couple of others also. So Edward Snowden came and spoke, and Julian Assange, and they were talking about ethics of privacy and surveillance. And I think at the moment, whether we're talking privacy, whether we're talking limiting people's negative use of certain platforms or whatever it might be, there are obviously many things that we have to take into account. So where do you stand on kind of protecting people, but then obviously not legislating too heavily so that you're limiting people's freedom of choice? And do we have freedom of choice to hurt ourselves through addictive behavior online, or should we curtail that ability?
Right. So I think there's really low-hanging fruit here for helping people with addiction. That we know there's a segment of the population. It happens to be a very small segment of the population, but that doesn't mean that we can dismiss these people who have problems. You know, they tend to have a psychographic profile for a person who's likely to become addicted, and so they're actually quite easy to figure out who has these addictions. We have all kinds of technologies now that can do this on an anonymized basis, but we can understand who's overusing a product. So to me, that seems like really low-hanging fruit. You know, why can't we help the very few people who do overuse, who do abuse these products? It seems like something that companies could do if they wanted to. Now, the challenge is that some businesses can't survive without the addicts, right? Facebook is not one of them. You know, a company like Facebook or Twitter, they'll be fine without the addicts. They can moderate those people's use, and in fact, their product might improve if these people, you know, slowed down and didn't produce so much clutter on people's news feeds. But when you think about a business like the gambling industry or online games, you know, there's a debate whether these industries could survive without full-fledged addicts, because a disproportionate share of their revenue, and perhaps, you know, I haven't run the numbers, but it'd be really interesting to see. I don't think these numbers are publicly available. They don't segment based on who uses to what degree. But if you took the users who are heavy, what the industry calls heavy users, you will see that they account for a disproportionate share of their revenue and their profits. So there's a really interesting debate to see, you know, my quick answer for, hey, when is it okay to addict people? Well, it's okay to addict people as long as your business doesn't depend on it. Because if your business doesn't depend on it, you can do something about it. You can curtail the addicts, right? I wrote a story about how many fitness products actually observe that the same proportion, this ratio of 2 to 5% of their user base, become really into using these fitness products. So I wrote a story about this woman named Zoe who got a fitness tracking device, and she found herself going up and down her staircase till 2 a.m. in the morning. She actually climbed the equivalent of the Empire State Building until 2 o'clock in the morning because this product was so engaging, right? It was such a great thing for her. But then, of course, she became addicted, right? It became harmful at one point. She actually injured herself, and then she discontinued use of the product. But that business doesn't actually want addicts. It doesn't. You know, a business like a fitness product, actually, by burning people out, by getting them addicted, harms the business model. Whereas other businesses, like you know, as I mentioned, the casino gambling industry or the online gaming industry with multiplayer games, for example, it's questionable to see whether these products and the business models can survive without the addicts. So that leads them to not want to do anything about them.
Mm. Yeah, that's tricky. It's interesting because there's that whole piece around responsibility and whether it lies in the hands of the companies or the people who, well, governments really that should legislate around that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more broadly then. I'd like to talk a little bit about behavioral sciences and how we're seeing an increase in people finding this sort of stuff interesting. So the number of books that are coming out around the subject. You, me, and Roger Dooley are doing a panel at South by Southwest in spring, and it's kind of nice to see that people like us are actually getting a bit of a stage to talk about this kind of stuff. Why do you think that people are becoming more interested, more broadly in the public eye in behavioral sciences and psychology?
Yeah, so I have a hypothesis that when I was at my last company, my last company started around 2007, and then we actually sold the business in 2011. And this was the time when customer development was kind of first becoming well known. Now, Lean Startup, where Eric Ries wrote his book, and we're all studying this process of talking to customers and getting user feedback, and that is a very valuable process. And it's a lot better than the way we used to build software, right? We used to build software by a bunch of people getting into a room, we'd lock the door, and then we'd create these waterfall charts for, well, we're going to create this feature, then that feature, then that feature, and we're probably never going to talk to any actual users until the product is done. And so that led to a very high failure rate. Well, now we're enlightened, right? Now we talk to customers, we get frequent customer feedback, we iterate on our designs, and that's all well and good. We still have to do that. But what I discovered implementing that process at my last company is that there's a lot of things that users can't articulate. A lot of things that customers do, the things that drive user behavior, that actually are very counterintuitive, that they wouldn't tell you drives their behavior, but actually does, right? Just one example, I mean, pick your heuristic, the scarcity effect, right? We know that people more highly value things that are scarce, but if you ask people, point blank, hey, if I had the identical cookies in 2 cookie jars, but one cookie jar had 10 cookies and one cookie jar had 2 cookies, which one would be more valuable? Which one would you pay more for? Well, people say they're identical cookies. They're the same, right? Why should I pay more? It's the exact same cookie. But we know that by that exact experiment that people will actually pay more for the cookies out of the cookie jar with only 2 cookies in them, right? But that people couldn't articulate that. So that's just one example. So I think to answer your question about why is there this increasing interest into behavioral psychology and into how we can use psychology in product design, I think it comes down to the fact that people are realizing that there's a whole lot that goes into what drives user behavior that people can't necessarily articulate. And as product designers, if we understand these deeper principles, if we can become more proficient in designing our products with these principles in mind, we can fail less, right? We can spend more time building the right solutions, the right features, as opposed to wasting time building things that aren't going to change user behavior.
Yeah, I agree. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd love to know what you think. Why do you think it's becoming more of an interesting topic?
I think possibly one of the reasons is because we now have access to the kind of sample sizes and tools that we didn't have access to before. So, for instance, I went and saw a group called Vika Vision in Amsterdam, and they're doing some really interesting stuff around face reading. So they've got this face reading software. If you go to facereader.com, I think it is, hyphenated, you can literally run webcam interviews or watch people watching videos on their webcams. And they will track, the software tracks in real time the micro expressions that they're expressing, I suppose. And so this previously, even if it was like 5 or 6 years ago, would have taken months to set up, months to code. And now you're getting real-time feedback with users all over the world in really, really quick succession. So you can do this incredibly detailed, incredibly difficult, complex analysis with people from all over the place in a very, very short period of time. And I think that ease of access and of technology and of data collection is probably also something that's propelled interest there, because it's become so much easier, and the threshold for entry is so much lower. So, I'm not a neuroscientist, I'm not a coder by any stretch of the imagination, and yet these tools are now accessible to me. And as long as we have an understanding about the psychology behind them and how they work and how they can inform us and inform our practice, then we can use them. So I think that's a really interesting shift that we've seen as well.
That's interesting. Yeah, there's this. The products themselves are leading to uh, more feedback as well. If you think about it, right? That in a way, products are changing for the users more rapidly than they ever have before. We used to be when we built software, we put out a release, we'd see what users think about it, and then maybe release 2.0, we change the product. Well, now products are continually being modified in real time, right? Many products are literally changing the product experience itself based on user behavioral data. It's interesting, when I was at my last company, we saw a lot of experiments running, and as people were building different games or different ad campaigns that we observed, what was interesting is that people would copy the things that worked, but they wouldn't really know why they worked.
Mm.
And that was a little frustrating because there wasn't this deeper understanding. There was just this mad dash to, well, it seemed to really work on that campaign, so let's do it again. Let's build that into our product because our competitors seem to be using it, and then they're successful, so let's copy that without really understanding the deeper psychology and the user needs that were being met behind why these techniques were being used.
Mm. I think what's interesting also is that taking this approach where we can build a more holistic or integrated understanding of people's context, their psychological context, their motivations, etc., is that no matter what kind of technology evolves, well, actually, principally because it's going to become more integrated in terms of wearable tech or implants or retinals, or whatever you want to sort of think about, or more gesturally based interfaces, or sound based or physical based interfaces. All of this stuff is becoming more and more akin to our natural physical environment, and I think that makes it even more important that we understand how people and why people behave the way they do, so that as we evolve technology, we can kind of make it easier and more intuitive. My only concern really is around choice, is around how much do we empower people to opt in to this psychological fitting. So like Eli Paris's book on the filter bubble about the homogenization of information that we get through Google, for instance, through mapping search results to previous behaviors. So, typically humans learn through receiving new information, new data about our surroundings, and then we adapt and we grow based on that new information. But what happens if you create an echo chamber in which you're fitting all the information that person's getting based on previous actions? Well, then you're curtailing our ability to access new information and to grow. So it's kind of, there's that element there that I'm concerned about, and then also creating or socially engineering structures and games and the rest of it that become so intuitive and easy to use that we don't question why they're so intuitive and easy, therefore reducing choice and our ability to make decisions that aren't completely our own. I know they're never completely our own, but like, do you kind of get what I'm going towards here? Like more covert manipulation than actually opting into an intuitive experience, and I think there's a difference there between those two things.
I wonder if it's a question of timeline. How long does it take to work these things out? Because every new technology has its goods and bads, and eventually new technologies come along to fix the bads created by the old technology, right? That's nothing new. Every innovation has its bads, has its downside, whether that's cost, whether that's side effects, unforeseen implications. And so that's kind of the story of innovation. But it seems to be that there's always this guinea pig generation. That few innovations had the kind of world-changing impact of the Green Revolution, right? And mechanization, the Industrial Revolution. All of these things were incredibly beneficial and increased lifespans, and they made the world healthier, and you could propose maybe happier as well, because they didn't have to deal with these problems of survival as much anymore, and people could live longer lives and wouldn't have to worry about starvation anymore. But of course, there are costs to that as well, right? Now we have environmental degradation. There's all kinds of things that come as a cost of these tremendous technologies. But the good news is that we tend to figure out new technologies to solve these problems. But in the interim, how quickly we can adapt to these previous technologies and find new solutions to them is the big question. So I'm confident that we are quickly figuring out what these technologies are doing to us and what the negative effects are. I think, by and large, the effects are very good, right? Very few people, I think, want to go back to an age before they had these smartphones and email and all the things that seem to hook us. But the solution is that we're finding new technologies to help keep us on track. That now we're finding that knowledge is no longer scarce, right? Information, data, we're flooded in information, whereas before that used to be scarce. That used to be precious to get access to information. Well, now that we have so much information, the new skill, the new scarce commodity is attention, right? How can you manage your attention to get the things done that you want to do? And so I use all sorts of tools actually, and I'm constantly looking for more to help me manage my attention. There's one program that comes to mind that I actually can't write without. It's called Freedom. I don't know if you've ever tried this app, but I don't know what I would do without it. It's a very, very simple app. All it does, it's a pre-commitment device. So you tell it how long you want freedom from the internet. So I will write in a 60-minute burst, and it turns off the web. So you can't just turn it back on and off. You actually have to restart your machine in order to log back into the web. And that bit of friction keeps me writing, right? It keeps me from, when I get bored or mentally tired, hopping onto the web. Instead, it keeps me focused on what I'm trying to do for that hour. And it's a great tool because, look, the things what makes these products good, what makes them so engaging, is also what makes them potentially addictive and, of course, very distracting.
Mm. That's true. I'm interested that you're outsourcing your self-discipline now.
Well, it's because I understand how powerful these technologies are.
Yeah.
These are not coincidences, right? I think many people look at Facebook and Snapchat and Twitter and Instagram and they think, oh, these kids got lucky. I don't think it's luck. I think it's through trial and error. It's through very deliberately understanding what drives user behavior. I'm not sure if these companies, all of them, and many of them have behavioral psychologists on staff today. Mm-hmm. But I think many of them, especially in their early days, just discovered things were working and did more of it. But then you see other companies, like the founders of Instagram were symbolic systems majors at Stanford. And symbolic systems is this degree that's 50% psychology and 50% engineering. So you see many of these companies started by people who really do understand the underlying principles of user psychology.
That sounds like an amazing degree. Absolutely fascinating. Right. Half engineering, half psychology. My dad was an engineer. My mum was a psychologist.
That's you.
Fascinating. Actually, I'm just checking the time. It's 5:30 already. Is there anything big that we should address before we hop off?
Well, this was a great conversation. I certainly enjoyed it. I hope you and your viewers did as well.
Oh, I'm sure they did. And also, so where can people get your book? Just to circle back around.
Sure, yeah. So I'm giving actually a special bundle for anyone who orders the book by the end of next week. It's got all kinds of free content about habits. There's a workbook in there. There's 2 ebooks. There's videos. There's all kinds of goodies you get for pre-ordering the book. It's at hookmodel.com, H-O-O-K, model, M-O-D-E-L.com. And, of course, the book is available at your local bookseller starting in the UK on the 6th and in the US on the 4th. And my blog is at nirandfar.com.
I love how you spell that. And Nir and Far, just for everyone listening, is N-I-R and Far. Also, you've got a couple of things coming up next week. So for everyone who's going to tuning in now, do you want to just give them a quick overview? Actually, it's the week after next of the dates that you're going to be in the UK, just so people can.
Oh my gosh! I've lost track of them. Maybe we can post them afterwards. I'll be in the UK the week after next.
All right. So if you want to tweet to Nir and you want to find out. Obviously, it's in the little dashboard at the bottom here, but at Nir Eyal. And if you want to, email or tweet to me, it's at the website. Nir, thank you so much for taking the time. It's been fun chatting with you.
It's been a pleasure. Appreciate it.
Cheers.